Hello, Joy Brooks, email and coffee. A Saturday morning and a special guest today, Derek Littell, who is the Hellenistic podcast. So, a little bit of history with history, history on top of history, a sandwich of sorts. Um, I love history. I love everything about history. All you need to do is mention something and I'll go Google it. But my roots, my college education, my studies back then um, were to become an archaeologist. And be that as it may, I am now an email marketing person. Odd. It's just research. These skills are transferable. But I never let go of my roots. And I found uh, Derek's Hellenistic podcast and became addicted to it, listened to it, and all right, became a fan, right? I'm a fan. I'm a fan. Ooh. And I contacted him. And lo and behold, he agreed to do the show. And what are we going to talk about? We're going to talk about one of my favorite people in history. A great man, a man of mystery, a man of romance. Alexander the Great of Macedon, who became one of the first Western conquerors. So we're going to talk a little bit about that, the concept of that, who the man was, and put him in his own time and try to understand what. So, Derek, please introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, thank you so much, first off, for having me on. It's always a treat to talk about a personal passion subject of mine. So, as my name is Derek. I'm the host and creator of what is called the Hellenistic Age podcast. That refers to the period between the death of Alexander the Great in 323 to the eventual death of Cleopatra of Cleopatra and Anthony and Cleopatra's fame, some 300 years later in 30 BC. Essentially, the term Hellenistic is kind of a shrink a very complicated subject. Just refers to Greek-like. It's a very modern term. It means the mix. It refers to the period where where much of Asia and North Africa was opened up to the Greeks following Alexander's conquests. There was establishment of kingdoms there, and eventually it all came tumbling down following the introduction of various factors such as the Roman Republic, the Parthian Empire, and then finally internal strife. But it's a fantastic time, and it's been a huge journey this past 5.5 years we're approaching now. So yeah, and I'm curious to see where it takes me next.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. History, the continuation of history is something that is so huge. People, when we learn it in school, it's sort of like, okay, chapter 5. Okay, chapter 5 ends, and now we're talking about something else. And you get this feeling that it ends, but it doesn't. It's sort of like paint that one color slowly becomes another, slowly becomes another, slowly becomes another, until you've got this enormous painting, this enormous scene of this to that to the next, and we're all children of that, all of us.
It definitely is for any sort of schooling. It really does feel, and as you get into history more, you begin to slowly realize that the many simplifications that are installed to make it easier for us to digest it quickly fall apart when you really scrutinize it. I mean, in my experience when I was in school, history class, ancient history, you get a bit of ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, and then you transition to classical Greece. Once you have the Peloponnesian War, maybe you skip to the rise of the Roman Republic. But between the rise of the Roman Empire or Julius Caesar and the Roman Empire, there's almost 400 years of history that are missing. And we're missing the period stretching exactly from the shores of Greece all the way to the Punjab and modern day Pakistan. I mean, when Julius Caesar was riding around in Gaul, there were still Indian or Greek rulers in India as ruling as kings. So, and even then, it's the whole idea. It's like when you realize, oh, okay, so when the classic question is, when did the Roman Empire fall? You could give easily 30 answers as to when that could be, but I really feel like I settle for simplifications. But at least if you acknowledge it, you can sort of piece together and understand, yeah, these things tend to overlap by generations. So it's always a huge challenge to try to explain that to people. But
And you
yeah,
could also argue that the Roman Empire is still in the Vatican, and the other half of it is over here in the United States.
oh
So
yeah.
it never fell. It never fell. It's interesting, and the biggest. Well, what's interesting is the way history has been handed down to us. So we've got these languages that we're trying to interpret, on rocks, on stones, on paper, on clothing, all over the place. We learn it, and sometimes it gets destroyed, so we lose it. Then it's passed down by word of mouth, and it becomes romance. And it's difficult over time. So, specifically in the case of Alexander, we do have people that are recording. So, he himself had a scribe that was recording things. Obviously, just like today, they're going to propagandize. Just like today. That's not something that we discovered. Propaganda has always been around. So, to what extent the initial writing, where Alexander traveled and had a scribe that was writing everything down, that Alexander was writing down, that other writers were writing down, those stories take on different characteristics. So, who was Alexander?
That's the principal question. I mean, with Alexander the Great, I mean, for background, the surviving extant sources we have come hundreds of years after his death. Of course, like, as you mentioned, Alexander had scribes. He was anything if he was a man who liked to brag about his own achievements. One of them was Callisthenes, a nephew of Aristotle. He had writ a history, but even historians who relied on him in antiquity thought Callisthenes was a bit of a blowhard, and his are questionable, almost impossible in terms of his descriptions. But we also know that Alexander's generals, Ptolemy, for example, king of Egypt, the founder, the great ancestor of Cleopatra, had wrote a memoir, and that's who was relied upon the most in the works of Arrian, who is probably our most, I guess you would call it, trustworthy or reliable Alexandrian source, who was writing 500 years after Alexander's death. So unfortunately, the people like Ptolemy had their own agendas and issues, and Ptolemy was writing 30 years afterwards, and he was trying to justify his own legitimacy as the king of Egypt. So trying to piece together a man as complicated, as larger in life as Alexander, I think Alexander would appreciate that he can be interpreted in so many ways. It adds to his immortality, as it were, his that cultural memory. There's a reason why that he has persisted down to the day, not only because of his actions, but just because he can be interpreted any way you can really imagine him. And there's probably good sources to back it up, because we don't really have anything to compare it to. And I think that's what I think the most fascinating part of it is. Every time I read Arrian, Plutarch, my perspective on him changes, or even modern day biographers, and I really do get a different lens on the man who ran from modern day Greece to Pakistan and down the Indus and back to Babylon.
Yeah, the oddity, we'll try to understand it through our lens. Okay? So we're going to try to think to ourselves, this man is a modern day conqueror who's colonizing the world, and he wants riches and he wants power, and we'll try to turn him into what we would consider a colonizer, because that's our lens today. I'm not saying that that's the lens 50 years ago. I'm not saying that's the lens 500 years in front of us or 500 years behind us. I'm saying probably most people would try to do that today. But first, the concept of colonization, it did not necessarily, it wasn't really the reason Alexander did what he did. It was more like revenge, Also, while they created colonies, right? The Greeks had prior to Alexander, sent colonies to Asia Minor, and they settled there. They became Easternized, changed a little bit, and we're talking about the Bronze Age. We're talking about thousands of years ago, and those colonies were not necessarily sent out to kill people. They were just sent out. It was discovery in the largest sense of the word. They took on the gods of the people that were there. They took the foods, everything. They literally survived. I mean, really survived. And they blended and they became slightly different. The stories changed, the gods changed, the dress changed, the language changed a little bit. So the concept of colonization to the Greeks in the 4th century does not match our concept of colonization. And Alexander's conquering or wanting to become the sovereign leader of an empire, again, does not mean that he wanted to be, now I'm going to use a horrible term, Hitler, and get rid of all of the Asians. That's the last thing that he would think of. He might have wanted revenge to start with, and I think that was it was a noble thought.
Well, the revenge concept as part of Alexander's mission statement, for maybe a lack of a better term, as the head of the Pan-Hellenic League after the hegemony of Macedon took over, his father Philip II, who's probably one of the unsung heroes of antiquity, who's being recognized for his achievements, managed to make Macedon from a backwater nation north of Greece to the premier power of the Peloponnese. Alexander had inherited this mission. Philip was actually was already in the punitive expeditions into the Persian Empire until he was assassinated in 336, excuse me. And Alexander had set out, when he got the Greeks together, he proclaimed that this mission was to take revenge for the Persian sack of the Temple of Athena in Athens, where currently the modern Parthenon now stands. This was part of the mission statement, and there are various other factors as to maybe why Alexander invaded. I mean, the Persian Empire was under a period of great duress at the time. It just come back from a civil war. The last great king, as it were, Darius III, was involved in that civil war and almost considered a usurper. And it was a opportune time to invade. And given the wealth of the Persian Empire, which had been the largest and most powerful the world had ever seen at that point, it was prime real estate. Now, the concept of colonization, in Alexander's time, it does feel more like a byproduct of him establishing a system of control over the empire he now dominated. As far as you mentioned, like with Alexander in his attitudes towards the Asian peoples, these could be, this is a general term, Persians, people of Asia Minor, Lycians, whatever you want to refer to them as. It's actually been arguable that Alexander famously had begun to adopt many of the customs and characteristics of his role as great king of Persia, great king of Babylon, whatever you want to call it. Some scholars actually like to make the comparison that he was the last great king of Persia before the Hellenistic period because he was so interested in taking on this role. So there is that kind of conflict in what he's describing as his revenge statement. He did destroy Persepolis out of revenge. Now, there's many stories about how that happened, but I think it was an intentional act to fulfill his role. But he clearly had an interest in taking on that role as emperor, or great king, emperor, whatever you want to call it. And that's one of the great conflicts of Alexander as a character, is what was his intention. I mean, the lens, as you mentioned earlier, was it's people have had different viewpoints. The French and English colonial empire saw him as sort of a predecessor, especially the British in India, who saw him as their predecessor of conquest of the Raj. And then later on, as the anti-colonial movements of the mid-20th century happened, for India, bringing that as an example, Alexander became a hated figure as a model of the British. And even to this day, a lot of nationalism has risen out of that. And Alexander is a scorned figure. Same in the Persian tradition. Iran is not a huge, the Iranians as a history do not look back as favorably on Alexander as maybe us in the West. So again, it's fascinating to see how trying to piece together this man from our lens point of view is it's really difficult, and it does change every generation or so, and it's always fascinating to see how it transfers even in the last 50 years, like you mentioned. I mean, I had my favorite biography by Robin Lane Fox is absolutely going to be different from the one written by Peter Green some 25, 30 years later, different from Bosworth. And then now here we are in the 2020s, and I'm curious to see what's around the corner.
Yeah, he clearly or not so clearly, there the difference between, at least the Athenians would say, the difference between Greece and the Persian Empire, they thought of themselves as being philosophers, lovers of wisdom, the right, doing the right thing, having a public forum. These are the Athenian Greeks, having a public forum, the beginning of democracy. This was where a lot of the philosophers were. Demosthenes, who did not like Alexander, was. But we've got Aristotle, who was not in Athens. He was from, I think, Stagira. But Aristotle, who is Alexander's teacher, was a student of Plato, who was a student of Socrates. So we've got this movement, education, paideia, going on in Greece right now. That is the core, or I would say they would think it to be the core of who the Greeks were, why they were different, why they would be, how they would consider a civilized people to behave, to be good, to aspire to goodness. And then the Persians, who they might have called barbarians, but that was only because bar was what they heard, and they said anybody who didn't speak Greek were barbarians because they heard bar, which would make sense. So when we say the Persians and we say barbarians, it wasn't because they were cannibals or any of the such. They were just speaking a language that the Greeks didn't understand. So the Persians, the Achaemenid dynasty, that ruling entity over in Asia Minor and as far as the Punjab in India, the Greeks would never think that they were stupid, that they were horrible, that they were uncivilized. They would only say that they were perhaps lazy in their eyes because they had more gold. They were able to they have a more leisurely life. There was a thriving dynasty over there. Large civilized groups of people, the Medes, the Phrygias, the Assyrians, the Egyptians. All of these people had been living there for thousands of years. They had a long history, and they became merged into this Achaemenid dynasty, a large group of people. So the Greeks actually may have emulated them to some extent and looked up to them, as far as technology goes. As far as how a man behaves, no. That would be the difference. So philosophically, there's a difference. There's no other, they would not consider them uncivilized. So, very broadly. So when Alexander is thinking about going to Greece and, going to Persia and seeking revenge for the burning of Athens, you're right. It's like, I hate to say it, it's weapons of mass destruction. It was propaganda. Let's get over there. And the point is, history repeats itself. There is a parallel here. So Alexander goes over there. I believe Alexander was going over there because he had a personal, he had pothos. Pothos being a desire. It's not sexual necessarily. It's a deep desire. He wanted to be great. He wanted to be known in history. He also wanted to see these things himself, something that Aristotle instilled in him. that it's not as great to talk about something as it is to know it. And by
I mean,
knowing it, it's that word science that really in the Greek means knowing. Really knowing, not saying, oh well, have you ever been to this restaurant? It's really great. You ought to go. It's going to the restaurant and eating the food and saying the food is really great. That's the difference.
I mean that idea of pothos is integral to a lot of interpretations of Alexander. That constant need for longing, desire. That actually is the key psychological characteristic that's expressed in Arrian. I think one of the stock phrases is like the king was seized. It's almost a condition that he's infected with. The desire, whether it be to explore new lands, to found cities, to learn more. This is part of that Alexandrian character that allows him to aim for the heights of ambition and glory. I mean, there's that famous anecdote of him allegedly sleeping with a copy of the Iliad under his pillow every night along with a knife. In that sense, Alexander clearly had models to strive for. He thought himself as a descendant of Achilles, the greatest of all the Greek warriors at Troy, and technically a man that Aristotle was not particularly fond of. But that idea that Alexander had to achieve that glory to not only live in terms of in fame, in terms of word of mouth, but that almost an apotheosis. I mean, we see at various points his the transition from being king of Macedon to then a son of Zeus Ammon after consulting the Oracle of Siwa. He goes on undertakes these enormous tasks for what is essentially personal fluff pieces, or as some sort
but it's
of
almost like Hercules. The deep, he's literally creating his own Homeric epic.
Oh yeah, Hercules is a perfect example of that. I mean, the Argiads all saw themselves as descendants of Hercules. As we recall, Heracles was not always a god. He was a man who was able to achieve glorious deeds, his labors, which allowed him to become a god. This is what becomes a big issue in the Hellenistic period: is the divinization of Hellenistic rulers as they're not walking, talking gods on earth, but by their deeds, they can certainly be transitioned into that period, and that's where you get that the imperial cult of like Augustus and that model. So Alexander really had that drive to do it. How much of that can be attributed to a sort of a romantic wanderlust? I don't quite know. I do think that he was driven farther by anybody of his peers, or at least of his successors, to do this sort of thing, sometimes to his detriment. But certainly it really is a characteristic that comes through in the sources, and I think it certainly colors a lot of people's modern perception of it. And I don't really know. I think it's one of his more fascinating aspects, at least interpretations nowadays.
He had no intention of returning. He had no intention of returning. He wanted to keep going. When he was in India, he was like, "Okay, let's go." And the troops are like, all right, we burn Persepolis and the dynasty's ours, and let's go home. I got something on the stove. And he's like, really? He had no intention. He had no intention of going home. And, that's why, cue the music. He's like Captain Kirk. He's on this mission, 5-year mission, to go where no one has gone before, to see, the civilizations. And he has no intentions. He's so excited by what he discovers over and over and over again that he is no longer that Greek, that Macedonian that first went out. He almost can't go back. Like, you can't go home again because he's not that person. And he's not, my opinion, he never intended to be king because he never laid out how that looks. He was a wanderer.
It certainly is. I mean, it would explain a lot considering the way things happened after he died. But I mean, Alexander, like, notoriously was left the empire in shambles. Effectively, he did not install a stable imperial administration. He just took whatever the Persians had, which was already starting to fracture in its own weight. And then famously, when he died, he had no male heirs to that were alive to take the throne. I mean, his only other legitimate son was still in the womb of his wife. He had been on campaign for almost 13 years, and yet he had not fathered a child. This was a big problem for the Macedonians, who were disturbed by his choice to make a woman from what is essentially modern Uzbekistan or Afghanistan to be his principal wife, a people that they conquered. We are Macedonians, we are Greeks. Why are you taking the wives of the slaves? Why are you taking this thing? And famously, there's the anecdote of when he died. Diodorus Siculus, a Greek historian of the 1st century BC, has the king allegedly say, who does the empire go to? To the strongest. A great funeral games will be played upon my honor. Inaugurating a period of 40 years of near constant warfare across the Mediterranean, across the ancient Near East, and even as far as Iran. So yeah, I mean, whether he intended to, I personally think that he was a really bad planner, and there might be other factors, but it definitely strikes me as someone who had no intentions of stopping. And I think he would, if he had not died of Babylon, of whatever it might be, disease, poison, he would not have lasted long anyways. He was burning himself out. He was not, his ambition did not survive his constitution or his endurance for living.
Certainly, we don't know where he would have ended up. But he left. He left. I think it was in Antipater. He left Antipater in Macedonia.
Mm-hmm.
So Macedon was in a regent's hand. And it was, the all of the city states had a government. So there was nothing that needed to be done except continue, make it so, number one. So he wasn't worried necessarily, they were fomenting war once again. That was one of the ways of getting him back, where he realized, oh, you know what? Antipater's going to become the king of Greece if I don't get. Oh, okay. They sort of got him thinking, I've got to go back for that reason, because the people that I've left there are going to eventually attempt to take over. But in any case, he's either so driven by discovery, or some will say that he had become an alcoholic drinking so much, and that he doesn't know what he's doing. I just tend to think that he's wanderlost with discovery, and there is no one that can tell him, you've got to go back you've got to run the country, because his mind is the city-state model or the satrap model, and in his mind, oh, they'll take care of themselves. I'm doing what I'm doing. I'm having a good time, and who wants to come? And nobody wanted to come. The only people who would probably go with him would have been the natives. And they eventually convinced him not to do that. And then he goes back, he starts back, and he ends up in Babylon, and he ends up passing away. So we don't really know. What would he have done? But we definitely don't see any plans for governing other than accepting the satrap in Asia, not changing it, because he set up leaders as satraps before he left. He conquered. He'd say, "Okay, you're the satrap now. See ya. Next town." So he would leave either the locals in charge, if they had paid him due respect, if he also respected them, or he would take one of his and put them in charge. Most of the time, he left those people, the families, in charge of their own land. But he had that marriage thing going on, and that's something to be discussed, because that could be in not by our means, but by means in those days. That's political. Intermarrying families provides claims to rule. So he married, as you said, he married the daughter of Darius. By doing that, he became the king. He becomes the king. And so he in Susa, he establishes uh, this. I think it was Susa, correct? The wedding
Yeah,
ceremony.
it was Susan. It was
Which
Susa.
Susa is in what is it? Is it in Iran?
Southwestern Iran.
Okay.
Yes.
So it's in Iran. So it's not the capital, but there are many different capitals: Persepolis, Susa. I mean, you could, Babylon. There were lots of very important places in Asia Minor and the Far East. So he has this wedding ceremony where the Macedonians marry locals. What, 200? Some huge amount of, and I think they took it to be a party, but they didn't take him seriously. And I think he was serious.
He definitely the wedding of Susa is interesting when you look at. I mean, as I'll lead into, that wedding was primarily amongst his nobility, amongst his friends and personal friends, the Philoi, as a way to interlink the nobility of the Persian Empire. So that could be peoples from the Persian Achaemenid royal family themselves, or it could be just from noble lords and ladies from around the countries. But it's it's as a testament that I think, according to tradition, all but one or two of them kept their wives. The one of them being Seleucus, Seleucus the First Nicator, who eventually took over most of the Asian territories of Alexander and started his own dynasty. And there's also that became an idea as part of the idea of what W. Tarn put in the early mid 20th century as the Brotherhood of Mankind, which is a very utopian outlook on it. Was Alexander trying to create a sort of unified global world viewpoint or race? I don't think so. I think it was more pragmatic in that sense. However, it is something that's been considered, but it was also a big point of contention for the Greeks and Macedonians, who either repudiated their wives, were frowned upon, and they were really mad that Alexander never took a Macedonian wife right off the bat. He married Roxana, who was certainly an important. The peoples of Bactria were the most troublesome state to conquer for Alexander, and that was Roxana's peoples. So it makes sense. I mean, Macedonian kings were polygamous. His father, Philip, had 7 wives and 7 children. So Alexander was not really differing too much. He took less wives, but the choice to make Roxana his principal wife was very unprecedented, and it led to a lot of controversy and eventually probably contributed to the ultimate extinction of his dynasty. And that's maybe where you go back to, did Alexander plan for a long-term succession? Clearly he didn't, because it failed immediately. So, but yeah, I think that's a really fascinating angle, is that concept that Persian Macedonian Greek fusion wasn't intentional. What was the purpose?
Yeah, I just, in my mind, that he that he took on the dress, that he even took on proskinesis, which is the what we all have always seen in all the Persian movies, where they kneel down and they salam to their god or their king. That was not a Greek thing. Nobody in Greece did that. And they were abhorred when they saw it, and he took it on and he wanted them to do it. Now that becomes something that is written, that's in the historical record, makes you wonder why they would put Alexander in that light. And I have a feeling it's because that, if anything, that was his intention of creating not necessarily utopia, but he had something like a Hellenization in mind. That was his government. Let everybody rule as they were ruling. But now we are a different people. We are a more modern man, a more intelligent man, a man that can reach to roots across, that can, one of the concepts between, it was more Roman than Greek. I don't think the Greeks did it as much, but the Romans would send their sons to live in foreign lands so that there would be a friendship, a bond between those places so that they wouldn't fight each other and they would back each other because there would be a family of a family type of a situation. The Greeks didn't necessarily do that, but it seems to me this is the forethought of that concept in Alexander's mind. If we have children of children who are from both, maybe they'll stop fighting, because after this is over, what do we have? Are we going to continue to fight? I mean, war was something that men did in those days. I mean, there was, you could be a farmer, you could be a philosopher, you could be a lawyer, you could be a doctor, you could be an army guy, you could be a cavalry guy. And there wasn't, you didn't become a Marine and do nothing. They didn't like draft people just to hang out at a camp and parade around. The kids were trained young, 16, and then became warriors in war. And they dreamed up wars. They made up stuff just so, because, it's what again, it was a concept of greatness. They fought in battle. There was more, storytelling, like when we were kids and our parents would read books to us in bed. That was entertainment in those days. So,
I mean,
they from little children are hearing these stories, these glorious stories of men who fight and, do good battles and are good. And these boys want to become that. So, this is who Alexander is. By no means a modern man. But that doesn't mean that his thoughts are so alien to us that we can't understand them. It's just that we just need to align them. Like, what was he thinking? I honestly don't think he was thinking of colonization or empire. I don't think he was thinking of Avola, and I think it was a mistake. But I don't. If anybody had, if there had been like Channel 9 News, Alexander, what are your thoughts about? He would be like a deep moment of silence, and it would have no answer.
Well, it's interesting to compare what Alexander's methods were, which were super controversial for the first generation to leave Macedon. The successors, like those like the Seleucids in Asia and Ptolemies in Egypt, they ultimately, it's interesting to see how they try to follow this. I mean, if we're thinking about Alexander, the pragmatic ruler of a new empire, adopting the customs and characteristics of his subjects, the majority of whom were not Greeks or Macedonians, it was unrealistic to expect them to not at least acknowledge their customs or at least take something on them. So, for example, like the wearing of Persian costumes, like the diadem, for example, is one of the big famous ones that becomes really popular. The use of purple, that sort of thing.
Pants.
Yeah, that too. And like when you compare the later on, like this, like for example, the Macedonian phalanx, Alexander was looking to train Persian youths in the ways of the Macedonian art of war, the famous pike phalanx that was used to conquer almost all the world. That became a more ethnicized or carried a certain status later on after his death. In Egypt, it was reserved almost exclusively for Greeks and Macedonians. It was designed as an arm of the Ptolemies, who ruled over a majority indigenous Egyptian population. In Seleucid Empire, it's a little bit more different. They seem to be more integrated, as we would want to put it. There's not as much weight in that role, but they did come to terms, and there's plenty of evidence that like the Seleucids, for example, were big into following the rituals of Babylon, of kings participating in the customs of the Babylonians. But this was often to the displeasure of the Greeks and later the Romans. There's this whole cyclical thing of every time you move a little bit more west, then what was once the West and who's hated the East becomes the new East. The Greeks thought the Persians were effete, were decadent, were slavish, even though they thought the Persian Empire was a fantastic civilization. They saw them as servile. Now, that's not really how it operated in Persia, but that's what the Greek perspective was. Then the Romans come along and think the Greeks are either lazy or just, eggheads, not really built on fighting machines. And we find this cycle continuing onwards. And that's a trend that goes on for generations afterwards. Even though at that point, large portions of these were Greek dominated, and the cycle continues. So yeah, I don't really know what to make of that. I mean, it's definitely something you have to look at. And, like you mentioned, Alexander, what was his aims? Probably nothing spectacular in that sense. He probably just like, whatever, we're good to go as long as I can go. Next stop Arabia, and then he dies.
Those elephants, wow, let's go look at the elephants.
Let's go check out the elephants.
Yeah, let's go. He had Nearchus, who was his naval captain. He was in the water. He was all ready to go. He was ready to go. And I think it was Porus, the satrap of India at the time, and had accepted him. I mean, it really does. It's sort of like it fascinates me. It's like this great guy, and you're thinking to yourself, how could this great guy, this guy who just did all of this stuff, miss the mark? Like, what are we missing here? What? And the Romans are writing about him, like Arrian, a writer, Plutarch. They're writing about him. Arrian specifically is writing about him in the age of Marcus Aurelius, the Stoic philosopher. If anything, Marcus Aurelius would have been studying Alexander. What's going on in Rome there? Marcus Aurelius is fighting off the hordes. It's the beginning and the end for the Roman Empire. I mean, lots of things are going on there. So Arrian is writing this story about this great guy that was a conqueror. So that lens that he's writing is going to turn Alexander into what the Romans would need. So the story that he's writing, although he says, I'm going to tell a story and it's just going to be the truth, I'm not going to put anything into it other than that. I'm not going to romanticize. I'm just going to tell you what I know. So he tells that story, and it's pretty good. I mean, obviously, it is about the military, what the military did at the time. So he's telling a military story for the military minded, and he attempts to delve into who Alexander is every once in a while, and he is telling, when he tells the stories, particular stories, telling the story of Bucephalus, or telling the story of what is it, Diogenes, who says to him, the shadow. It's a good story that Alexander's in Greece. He says to Diogenes, who's a great philosopher, he says, what do you want? And Diogenes says, could you please move out of the sun? You're in my way. And, Alexander looks at him and says, okay, that's pretty cool. This is all the man wants. He just wants to be in the sun. He tells that story as if it's supposed to mean something. Why is he telling that story? Because that's telling what, he's telling of the characteristics that he feels are important in Alexander that make the man. And we look at these stories and go, why is he telling that story? Arrian doesn't know why he never set up any government. He doesn't have any story about that. I mean, there's the Anabasis and the Indica.
Yep, and there was a lost history that he wrote of the period immediately after Alexander's death called The Events After Alexander, which sadly is lost, but we do have fragments of it. But yeah, he clearly was. Arian is an interesting character himself, I think. I mean, he served as a commander underneath Trajan, a man who famously it was inspired by Alexander and warred in Parthia, who were the modern day analog or then analog of the ancient Persian Empire. The Romans had a real love-hate relationship with the guy, Alexander I'm referring to. Um, the Romans famously were so monarchical, anti-regal, even though they were in the midst of a new monarchy by the days of Marcus Aurelius long past. But like Alexander clearly was not the model in a lot of ways. I mean, Livy famously bragged. He says, "Oh, he creates this whole hypothesis about, well, what if Alexander turned west as opposed to east? He would have been destroyed by Rome and all that jazz." But then you have men rising during the Republic, like Scipio Africanus, Pompey the Great, and famously Julius Caesar. They all emulated the man who had conquered the world at only 32 years old. There's a famous example of Julius Caesar apparently weeping in front of the statue, saying, you know, like, I'm Alexander's age, and I have done a fraction of what this king has done. But he also became a model, as we find in some of the other sources, as a figure of intense emotion, of almost irrationality at some points. Plutarch has a lot of these characteristics where he is like just full of this energy, this emotion, a very emotional guy. That's not really what is the ideal of a Roman emperor per se. Arrian was probably interested. I mean, he relied on the works of Ptolemy, and according to his logic, Ptolemy was a king, therefore his word should be pretty trustworthy. A king wouldn't lie. I don't know if I would agree with
Never,
that logic necessarily, but that's
never.
how he put it. And maybe it was his intended for Hadrian or Marcus Aurelius as a model. And yeah, I know that Alexander was at least a figure of a number of anecdotes. I don't remember if it was Seneca, but certainly St. Augustine, the Christian writer who derived from an earlier work. There was a whole comparison between Alexander the Great and a pirate, or a conversation between Alexander the Great and a pirate that he had captured, who the pirate apparently stated something along the lines of, well, you and I are no different, except I don't have a crown. So Alexander clearly was a good contrast for maybe more negative characteristics as part of that. And even though Romans loved to emulate him, they didn't always want to be him per se.
Well, you know, the Romans were the Greek political model was the city-state. I mean, to some extent. So there were lots of little cities that were independent. They may have aligned themselves, and the Greeks were famous of, you know, aligning themselves and fighting, you know, months later with the same people that they aligned themselves. But they didn't pay tribute. They were independent, and they all had their own government. So oligarchy stands there, whether good or bad. But, you know, Athens would say that the people ruled Athens. That's what they would say. But the Romans were fanatics for rules and regulations, and this is what we do. And, you know, I mean, the Roman Empire was bureaucracy, for goodness sake. Was it the birth of bureaucracy? No, it wasn't. I think a lot of the, you know, if Hellenism did anything, it brought the concept of empire, which the Greeks did not have. The empire was from the East. So it brought those concepts through from Hellenized Greeks to the Romans, where they took that bureaucracy and they built it up. So, you know, the Eastern Empire, whether it was, as I said, the Medes, the Phrygians, the Assyrians, the Hittites, the Egyptians, you know, we go back and back and back. They had bureaucracy. They had hierarchy. They had established, you know, you do this and you do that, and you don't do, you know, you guys don't do this and that. They had established that. They had thousands of years of that, for better or for worse. the Greeks came into it and they were young. They were the new kids on the block. And what the Athenians were doing was something very new, very new. And I mean, Philip, who was the one, writing the stage or setting the stage for the revenge of Persia, he wasn't Athenian. He he was a king. That was his model. He was king. So it was very odd. Very odd setting. Very, very odd setting. And again, he was the king of Macedon, which is a very small country. What is it? I mean, Macedon is there, but it's bordered but Bulgaria, um, uh, Croatia. I mean, it's in that area above Greece. It's not Greek at all. So they didn't think like the Greeks. And we know the Greeks. Today, the two different thoughts that come out of Greece are the Spartan and the Athenian. And the Spartan is way different, way different. And it did, I mean, although I would say that many to this day, soldiers will attempt to be trained like Spartans. I mean, Marines will train like Spartans. That's a whole new story. That's a whole different story. That's a whole different, it's a whole different story. But I mean, we have to understand that that is the setting that Alexander is in. We're talking about disparate countries doing wildly different things, not aligned to anybody. The only thing that Alexander had when he left was the League of Corinth that Philip created so that he could get the Greeks together and make them sign a contract not to fight each other so that he could go over to Asia and do whatever it is that he wants to do. And similarly, it would have been interesting to know what Philip wanted to do.
That's the great paradox of it all. I mean, you have Macedonia, which was this backwater. There's a famous speech by Alexander proclaiming how Philip turned the men of Macedon from goat herders to the hegemons of Greece. And now this is a controversial one. We're considered almost half barbarian. They were barely Greeks. They were only, the royal family was considered Greek, but the Macedonians themselves, it was a very gray area. And the Macedonians always distinguished themselves from the Greeks. I like to compare it like, say, maybe a Cajun would see themselves, a Cajun person living in Louisiana would see themselves different from someone living in the Bronx. They're all part of the same family, but clearly there's that identity issue. However, I mean, the concept of the city-state versus the Macedonian monarchy, I mean, prior to Alexander's reign, or I guess the Hellenistic period, kings were pretty far and few. I mean, Sparta had its dual kingship, but that was a balance. Sparta was a bizarre state as it was, so it's hard to use that as an example. But the Macedonian kings, it's all about personality. The king was the central figure. His bureaucracy or lack thereof was about personal relationships with his nobility. And this trend continued into the Hellenistic period. Of course, you have in Ptolemaic Egypt a very developed system of bureaucracy, but for the large part and parcel, it was very small and personal in scale. The king had to be present in these events. They had to lead their men into combat. Alexander maybe took that a little too far and nearly got killed for it, but later kings would do the exact same thing. There's a number of them that got killed right in battle of freak accidents. The Romans, when they later took it over, I mean, there was that whole problem of how did the city-states reconcile the fact that, okay, well, there's now three major kingdoms that we have to, we're technically under the dominion of, but we want our autonomy, or at least some perspective of it. Sometimes that emerged as rebellions. Sometimes that was like a negotiated understanding, like, yeah, we'll pay homage to, let's say, Antiochus of the Seleucid Empire, but we have our own government we internalize, and maybe we pay tribute to the king here and there. So we're technically free, but not really. And the Romans themselves kind of stumbled into this and were baffled by the arrangements. They were they're like, oh, okay, this is interesting. But they did adopt it, and I think it's a testament to the Hellenistic monarchs that the that it was 1,000 years between when the last Roman emperor was deposed in Italy and then the last Roman Empire emperor in Constantinople died upon the arrival of the Ottoman Turks. Clearly, there was some success, and there's a reason why the Roman Empire lasted, politically speaking, as long as it did in the East, where the Greek kings ruled, versus in the West, where maybe there wasn't that established tradition of where the Greeks were ruling over, or where the Hellenistic kings were. Places like Iberia, Gaul, Britannia, stuff like that. And it's interesting to try to trace it together, and that's part of my ultimate mission, is to see how that the Hellenistic period formed that foundation that was continued on by the Roman Empire on a much longer scale. And that's something that Alexander, in part, can be easily credited for, though maybe more as a knock-on effect, a domino, as you will.
Well, it certainly helped to continue knowledge. So we have the library at Alexandria. And then as we start moving into the Parthians, and then what, there are the Saracens, there are all these rulerships, the Moguls, and then they become the empire that begins to move over to Europe, and they take over, and they had that continuum of science, and that is and will be the legacy of the Hellenistic era. There was a continuum. There was a respect for knowledge. Again, the Greeks felt that man was man, that you weren't going to change a man, that his nature was what it was, but that technology would change. And that is what propelled knowledge, into the Roman era, past the Roman era, what we call the Dark Ages, or, then blooming into the Renaissance, is just that knowledge was held hostage, so to speak, rewritten so that the new era could emerge. There was the Judeo-Christian versus the Muslim, that we're still living that upheaval, that movement of peoples that literally moved across the world, and are, certainly there's, we have the Far East and we have China, but China kept to themselves purposefully. We have other, the Indians. There are huge mountains around there, and for whatever reason, they were saved to some extent until the modern era. But we have this movement of people, Genghis Khan coming across the steppe with an empire. We have this incredible movement, and at some point, a lot of that knowledge gets lost. And that's the Dark Ages.
Unfortunately, that period. As I like to maybe think about it, where the Hellenistic period was all the patronage of the Hellenistic monarchs who love to employ scientists and philosophers, and there's a certain what would you call it, prestige factor of having some of the most brilliant minds in the world at your beck and whim, doing your favors. The Ptolemies, as you mentioned, in the Library of Alexandria is probably the most famous example of this. And later on, Pergamon would later have something like that, as would Rome. This sort of tradition survives for a long time, and I think that I think it's important to recognize that we focus on maybe the Latin West and to a lesser extent the Greek East as the successors of Imperial Rome, which is therefore that successor of the Hellenistic system. But the Islamic empires like the Umayyads and the Abbasids were also heirs to that tradition.
Yeah.
They did control most of the Levant and parts of Mesopotamia, which were all interlinked for many, many centuries. And unfortunately, it's just one of those tragic cases where you see the loss of these texts over time. I mean, thankfully, the Library of Alexandria, I mean, we lost it, but it did its job by circulating what we called maybe the most important, or what maybe the ancients deemed to be the most important texts of your Sophocles, your Euripides, mostly plays, but we do have your geographies by like Ptolemy, later on Eratosthenes. It really is a shame where, I mean, like the Arabic tradition did preserve quite a bit of it. I know primarily Aristotle was a big one, as were a few scientific treatises by Euclid. In the Greek East and Byzantium, we have a lot that we know that was later on lost around the turn of the millennium, around near the time of the Crusader sack at the Fourth Crusade. So how much we really are missing, I mean, for perspective, I mean, the Library of Alexandria, allegedly somebody did a catalog of it in the 3rd century BC. It was dozens and dozens and dozens of scrolls of all the titles were missing. How many of those are plays versus how many might have been revolutionary? We don't really know. But I'd say anything we lost from antiquity is a tragedy in of itself. So it's always, there's a whole joke of people trying to lamenting the loss of the Library of Alexandria, but it's amazing what you were so filtered down to the present day of what we maybe interpret antiquity through as a lens.
And it's very important to be open-minded to understand that there's one person here and there's one person here and they're different, and then they meet and then they change again and they become a little bit more like each other. And that's what's going on for ages and ages and ages. Yes, man's nature probably will never change. His technology will, but along with that, the culture continues, and the culture is an amazing amalgam of everything. You've got your Greek gods, you've got your Roman gods, which were similar. You've got Zoroastrianism, which is a monotheistic religion. And we could, go into that conversation all by itself and discuss that, because that in itself is setting up the East differently. And the East, while the West attempted to be godlike, the East separated gods completely from their rulers. There was, aside from the pharaohs who said that they were the gods, the East would not necessarily do that. The East would not necessarily do that. And the concept of there's a royal line. But there I don't know, from what I have read, there are not all of these stories like, Zeus appearing as a swan or a bull and, having a child, and then we have Heracles, those things that wasn't happening in the East necessarily. If anything, if there is something in the record, it is a romanticized version of something, and not necessarily how they attributed their gods. It was the cultures are different, and then they met. And we're still going through that now. And it's amazing. Which is why I love history.
And I like I find it fascinating to piece together how I think one of the things that attracted me to the Hellenistic period was it was a time of intense coexistence, cooperation, conflict, where you see how different cultures adapted to one another. That idea of the Hellenistic period, when it was originally formulated, was more so the transfer of Greek Hellenistic ideas into Eastern cultures. But as we learned over time, and we've had more evidence, it was often the other direction. It was oftentimes independent of each other. And it was oftentimes, the idea of identity is something that's so interesting to me. Is, let's say, for example, a Greek living in Afghanistan whose maybe ancestry is mixed with Bactrian, or maybe one. Here's a better one. A famous example is a person that we know as Heliodorus. This was a guy who lived in the middle of what is Madhya Pradesh in India, set up a pillar and wrote on it in what is this? Let's see, it was going to be Sanskrit. Excuse me, it was Sanskrit, celebrating the Vasudeva, of Vishnu, an incarnation of Vishnu. He calls himself ethnically a Greek, a Yawana. That's a derivation of the Persian word Yona, which is referring to Ionian, the Greeks of Asia Minor. So we have a guy clearly referring himself as Greek, but he's adhering himself to an Indian deity, a Hindu deity, and also probably makes references a bit here and there to the Mahabharata. So how do we supposed to interpret this guy? Is it a Greek who's adopted the customs? Is it a person who happens to have a Greek name that is, sees himself as Greek, but then his ancestors go back maybe a couple centuries? It's so many instances of that. And unfortunately, there's always the lens of interpretation of, when you see rebellion of, say, let's say the Egyptians rebel from the Ptolemies like they did in the turn of the 3rd century. Is that a nationalist rise of the Egyptians against the Greeks? Is it something more complicated due to environmental or economic factors? Is there that cultural clash? I find that the most interesting elements as to see, how do these people react to one another's ideas and knowledge? And, what does that mean for their identity? What does that mean them as a person? And unfortunately, we don't get that as often, but there are nuggets of gold here and there that really do hint more at this complicated structure.
Yeah, and that's sort of, I don't know, it's a moment of grace where you read the history and you understand that there are people involved, just like today. You don't know. You just don't know. You're discovering perhaps a viewpoint or a point of view that you may not have had before, and it can shift at any point in time. And that, people who say, oh, you flip-flop, I think that's valid. And I say often, I have lots of opinions, and I guarantee that it will change at any point in time, because anybody can change my mind. And I do think that as people, we do that often, and I think that learning should never end. That fascination with anybody, anything, any place, anything should never change. It's not appropriation. It is the highest form of praise. And it's very difficult. And I think that if we don't do it, that Hellenization, that it won't bring us into the future. We'll stagnate. We'll end up going back into, the cave. Oh, that's another story to tell. We'll end up going back into the cave where we don't see, we see shadows. That's all we see. We don't see the fact that everything has perspective. Everything has dimension. It's not simple. Yesterday was yesterday. Today is today. And tomorrow, I don't know. And, let's all just try to do the right thing. Was that all that Alexander was trying to do? Sometimes I really think it was that simple in his mind. It was that simple in his mind, and he had no idea. And there was no there was nobody before him that had done what he did. So there was no, okay, well, this is what we do now, guy. Because, this was what we did before. So now we've got to do this. So, can we talk about government now? Alex, can we sit down, have a glass of wine and talk about government? Because that's the next thing to do. There was no status. There was no status quo. What he had done, there was none. again, even though there were great empires in Persia and they had done that, each ruling dynasty, the Achaemenids, the Medes, the Phrygians, the Hittites, the Assyrians, we're going to keep saying the same things over again. They had their own empires, and each one added the next one to it. But when they did that, they didn't create a new government. There was no new government at that time. They were all little places with little kings and noblemen and ladies and gentlemen and lineage, and that was the status quo. That was, we have this land, you have, you work for us, you're a merchant. These were professions that had been there for thousands of years and really didn't change. They just grew into bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and farther and farther and farther. And it wasn't, the bureaucracies were built upon, I'm sending you grain and you're sending me purple dye, and you're married to so-and-so, and this, creates a union. I mean, that was the bureaucracy. It was pretty simple, oddly enough. It's not, it was what held them together, and when that fell apart is what destroyed empires. Very simple. It's like when the strongest, what Alexander is attributed to saying, I leave my empire to the strongest. Are we still there? Are we still doing the strongest thing? Yeah. We're still doing the strongest
I
thing.
mean, if you could think of Alexander as maybe as best described as a force of nature, running amok throughout the world, that's definitely a valid way of putting it. And I mean, when you have these periods of this almost a watershed moment, I mean, think of how different the world is today compared to the eve of the First World War in 1914. I had family members who lived until relatively recently who were in the age of kings and emperors, and the Ottoman Sultan was still in power, that died in the late 2010s. And nobody would think of that the change and chaos that it can be inflicted either by a single person or by a collection of events. I think that the way the Hellenistic world was built was factored in by the various, was contributed by various factors that enabled someone like an Alexander to step in, and whether it be, you consider him as a tyrant, conqueror, as a bringer of civilization, as a monster, the Alexander the Accursed, as maybe the Zoroastrians would like to put it. Clearly, he made a change, and I think that you wouldn't have that radical of a worldview without a personality like Alexander's. Now, who was Alexander? That's a question that could be answered by somebody else, or it could be there could be a million answers. But clearly, the impact he had is come down to the present day.
And we're still arguing or aligning and arguing over the concept that goodness and power and control are the same things, right? So, the person that's greatest, I shouldn't say goodness, greatest. The person that is greatest controls the most. Divide and conquer. That is an old concept of divide and conquer. And we're still having that discussion. To this day, no one's ever changed it. So the Greeks were right. Human nature never changes. And, and history repeats itself, and we're deaf to it. We're deaf to it right now, and that's not a negative way to end the conversation. It's a way just to say, let's not be deaf. Let's, if we can understand the past, we can better understand the present, and we can build a better future. I mean, that's my belief. Am I a philosopher? Yes, I am. I am a lover of wisdom, and I really do think that if we lifted every man and gave him wisdom and took, took uh, their lesser natures and exposed them and taught them how to, well, what Aristotle did for what Aristotle tried to do for Alexander, to control yourself. Just take the moment and pull it back, control yourself. If we could all do that, would we be fighting? I don't know. We would be enlightening each other, teaching each other. Peace, brother. I don't know. I would like to think that. I really would. Do you have? Can you share with the audience places that you are on the internet, or things that you're doing, or anything that you want to leave us with? Something.
Sure. So if you're remotely interested in the history Alexander the Great, or more specifically the period after Alexander, you can find my show, the Hellenistic Age Podcast, on virtually any podcast platform. You can find my website at www.hellenisticagepodcast.com. I make my audio. I release usually about once a month or so. Right now, I'm finishing up with the end of Antiochus III the Great, another great figure of a complicated man, and soon we'll be moving into the Hellenistic sciences in the next few months. So it'll be an interesting treat, and we still have. Oh God, I'm 5.5 years into it, and I think I'm only about 130 years covered, so 140 years covered. So I'm halfway there. So there's plenty of room for you to catch on. And I thank you once again for inviting me. It's always a treat to talk about Alexander. I like to anybody who can twist their ear and speak out about it. It's always a great opportunity for me.
I appreciate it. I find it a nostalgic moment to be able to have this conversation. I see my professor. He would get so excited, and he would be, he would say Callisthenes, and he would be spitting practically. And whenever I read anything, and the word Sparta comes up, it's like Sparta. I'm like, oh my goodness. So it's been exhilarating. Thank you so much, Derek.
Thank you very much.
And that's a wrap for this episode. A little bit of history, a little bit of oddities, and I hope you found it to be enlightening. Thank you, and ciao.